We're so happy to be here with you in person and virtually for this highly anticipated event. I'm Jennifer Weeks, County Librarian for the Santa Clara County Library District, and one of the 3 co-chairs of Silicon Valley Reads, along with City Librarian Jill Bourne from the San Jose Public Library, and Dr. Marianne Dewan, County Superintendent of Schools. Tonight is special, not only because we are able to host this event live, but because it's the 20th year anniversary of Silicon Valley Reads. Now, some of you have been with us since the very beginning, and we appreciate you. We also want to thank our advisory board members who have played a key role in helping to keep Silicon Valley Reads relevant and current throughout the years. Will past and current board members please stand? So, thank you. As most of you know, Silicon Valley Reads is a community engagement program made possible by community support, and our program couldn't happen without our donors. You can see a list on the back of your program, and we'd like to thank all of our donors and give a special acknowledgement to our major donors, Elise and Michael Parsons, the County of Santa Clara, Los Altos Library Endowment, the Silicon Valley Library System, Friends of the Saratoga Libraries, Cupertino Library Foundation, Santa Clara County Library District Foundation, First 5, and NBC Bay Area. We would also like to thank De Anza President Lloyd Holmes and De Anza College for generously donating this venue for tonight's event and supporting us with that wonderful art show at the Ufrit Museum outside. Thank you to the Commonwealth Club for recording and live streaming this event tonight. And last but not least, our sincere appreciation goes to our amazing moderator, Sal Pizarro, and our wonderful featured authors, who you will hear from shortly. So now I'd like to introduce Maya Lewis and Jennifer Uyoga, 2 De Anza College students who will acknowledge the land that we are on. Following the land acknowledgement, we'll show a short video before our program gets started. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Office of Equity staff members humbly work in unceded Ohlone territory here in De Anza College, also known as the South Bay and/or Silicon Valley. We live among the original caretakers and stewards, the Muwekma Ohlone tribe of the San Francisco Bay Area. We recognize De Anza College sits on the crux of Ramaytush and Tamian tribal lands. Our vision is to continue a beautiful legacy of ancestral wisdom and cultural keeping in relationship to the land with much love and respect. We understand we do this work with the contradiction that we are in occupied territory after the massacre and genocide of Ohlone peoples, with Western definitions of political borders.
Thus, with more conviction, we are determined to educate ourselves as staff, faculty, students, and as a community, to decolonize and deconstruct, to make room for ongoing unschooling, to learn cultural humility, giving life to social justice inside and outside the classroom, centering First Nation peoples, and through relationship building. In this way, we stay true to an Indigenous way of life, to the core values that involves to all my relations. Thank you.
Welcome to Silicon Valley Reads. For the past 2 decades, we have encouraged people of all ages to read and discuss featured books to engage the community and promote dialogue about important topics. Throughout this time, we have enjoyed visits from dozens of prominent authors.
Hello, my name is Francisco Jimenez. I participated in the Silicon Valley Reads in the year 2003, the year the program was inaugurated. My book, Breaking Through, was the very first book selected for this honor, for which I am most grateful.
Hi, I'm Chris Grabenstein.
And I'm JJ Grabenstein.
And I was so excited when my book, Escape from Mr. Lemoncello's Library, was a Silicon Valley Reads Choice back in 2014.
And Shine, a book we wrote together, was a Silicon Valley Read in 2021.
And so together we'd like to say, Happy 20th anniversary! We said that well.
My name is Emmi Itäranta. I participated in Silicon Valley Reads in 2016 with my book Memory of Water and had a couple of memorable, lovely months in California. Happy anniversary to Silicon Valley Reads.
Hi, my name is Rachel Kong. I'm the author of Goodbye Vitamin, and I was part of Silicon Valley Reads in 2018. Happy anniversary.
Hello, Silicon Valley Reads. This is AJ Jacobs. I am the class of 2019, and I want to wish you a very happy 20th birthday. Here's to 20 more.
Hi, Silicon Valley Reads. I'm Kathy Chung. I was a visiting author in 2020, and I had such a good time. Thank you for reading my book and for talking with me, and happy 20th anniversary.
Hi, my name is Reina Grande, and I am the author of the memoir A Dream Called Home, which was a Silicon Valley Reads 2022 selection. Thank you so much for selecting my work, and thank you so much for uplifting and celebrating immigrant voices and diverse voices. I want to wish you a happy 20th anniversary, and here's to 20 more.
Hi, I'm County Supervisor Joe Simidian. And I was really delighted that we could recognize Silicon Valley Reads at our most recent Board of Supervisors meeting. You know, it's not every day we get a chance to celebrate and acknowledge 2 decades of community building, and certainly not 2 decades of community building through the shared experience of reading for all residents of Santa Clara County. This year's theme, of course, is Journey to New Beginnings. I think it's clearly well designed to engage residents of all ages and backgrounds here in the county. So let me just say, congratulations and thank you. I look forward to your next 20 years as we celebrate this past 20. And now I've got to go because I got a couple of books to read. Take care and thanks.
Silicon Valley Reads was started in 2003 by the Santa Clara County Superintendent of Schools as an American Leadership Forum project modeled after Seattle Reads' citywide reading program. But it was the first of its kind to incorporate an entire county. The positive response from the community helped propel the program forward. 2023 marks the 20th anniversary of Silicon Valley Reads. Each year, we select books, themes, and programs that are timely, important, and meaningful to people throughout Silicon Valley. As the community has grown and progressed, Silicon Valley Reads has evolved to become more inclusive and reflective of the communities we serve. Led by the Santa Clara County Office of Education, the San Jose Public Library, and the Santa Clara County Library District, partnering with libraries, schools, and a myriad of community organizations allows Silicon Valley Reads to offer a breadth and depth of free programming to appeal to the diverse audience that comprises Santa Clara County. As we celebrate 20 years, we are excited that you will join us to embark on a journey to new beginnings, with books and programs to move us forward as individuals and bring us together as a community. Thank you for being part of our Silicon Valley Reads community. Thank you to our generous donors.
Thank you so much to our students for that touching land acknowledgement, and I hope you all enjoyed the video. I'm Dr. Marianne Dewan, County Superintendent of Schools, and we have a special guest in the audience with us tonight who you may recognize from the video, Francisco Jimenez, our very first Silicon Valley Reads author. Francisco, thank you, Francisco, for standing and giving us an opportunity to give you a big round of applause and to thank you for helping us get started. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator and our authors. First, our moderator, Saul Pizarro has written the Around Town column for the Mercury News since 2015. Oh, since 2005.
Yeah.
His column covers the people and events surrounding the cultural scene in Silicon Valley, and he has been on the Silicon Valley Reads Advisory Board since 2006. Welcome, Saul. Kai Harris is the author of What the Fireflies Knew. What the Fireflies Knew was recently nominated for an NAACP Image Award, which honors outstanding achievements and performances of people of color. Kai is a writer and educator from Detroit, Michigan, and she currently lives in the Bay Area, where she is an assistant professor of creative writing at Santa Clara University. Welcome, Kai. Amanda Skenandore is the author of The Second Life of Mirielle West. She is a historical fiction writer and registered nurse. Amanda comes from a family of die-hard scientists who are also readers. Her first novel, Between Earth and Sky, won the American Library Association's Reading List Award for Best Historical Fiction. She grew up in the Colorado Rockies and now lives in Las Vegas with her husband and their pet turtle, Lenore. Welcome, Amanda. Thank you. We are very much looking forward to hearing from these great authors. We will be accepting questions on note cards throughout the program, and we'll have dedicated Q&A time at the end. We have a few Silicon Valley Reads Advisory Board member volunteers who are scanning the audience. So if you need a card or you have a question to be collected, just put your hand up and one of our advisory board members will collect it. Now, please take this time to silence your phones and what you've all been waiting for. Take it away, Saul.
Thank you, Dr. Dewan. So it's really thrilling to be back here at Anza College with all of you. And of course, we're also welcoming our audience that's online, wherever you may be tonight or watching this at some point in the future. It's been 3 years since we were able to be together in person, and I've been thrilled to see so many familiar faces in the audience here with us tonight. But tonight's only a little bit about you. We're looking forward to your questions, and it's very little about me, but it's mostly about these three great authors that we have with us tonight to talk about their books that have been selected for Silicon Valley Reads 2023. Now, just a little note before we get started. I know every year some of you have not finished all of the books. Maybe you haven't started any of them yet. Maybe this is your kickoff for it. We're going to be touching on themes and characters, but we'll be avoiding spoilers so you don't have to worry about hearing something that you shouldn't hear. But, and I'll be watching the audience questions for that too. So keep it spoiler free. So our theme this year for Silicon Valley Reads is Journey to New Beginnings. And what I certainly notice about all of your books, of course, part of the reasons you were picked is there are all about journeys. Some of them are physical journeys from one place to another. Some of them are emotional journeys within a person. Some of them are both in there. But to start us off, I wanted to ask each of you about your own personal journeys as writers and how you got here and what inspired you to write. Amanda, tell us about your journey.
Well, I'll say that I always loved stories and writing, even when I was a young girl. Instead of, like when you're in junior high and high school and you're like passing notes, or at least we used to pass notes before you would text notes to your friends. And I had a friend, and she and I would pass stories back and forth. So I'd started in period 1, and then she'd take over and write some in period 2, and back and forth, throughout the day. Probably when we should have been paying attention to what they were teaching. But it was a lot more fun. But then I got to college, and I decided, well, I should do something practical. And so I studied nursing, and spent a couple of years nursing, but found that I was not connecting very well with the job, was at a particular place that I didn't enjoy, and I just started to think, this isn't what I want for my life. I don't want to be hating what I do every single day. So I took a short story class at the local college, and it really rekindled this idea of the potential, like you mentioned, of story and what stories can do. And the teacher, he said, short stories are great, but he said, a novel can change your life. And I just really took that to heart. And so I told my husband, I said, I'd like to quit my job and try to write a novel. And he said, are you crazy? I'm sure that's what he was thinking. But he was so gracious and said, well, okay, let's make this work. And I did. I quit my job. I wrote a book and then just sort of thought, okay, world, here it is. And it wasn't a very good book. It was never published, but it taught me a lot. In particular, that this is a long process. So I realized, okay, I need to go back to nursing. And I did both for a long time. And, in the end, especially with this book, it served me very well. I've since moved away from what I was originally doing, and now I do infection prevention nursing. And I was finishing the second life of Mirielle West right as the pandemic was beginning. And, of course, then there was this great need for infection preventionists. Most of the time, people want us to go away because we're always telling people, please wash your hands. And they don't want to hear that. But, of course, at that moment, it was obviously so needed. And there was so much fear, right? And unknown. And it was a great, I would say, hope for me, right? Like I had read about the people at Carville, what the story is based upon, and people who had also been quarantined and locked away. And then there was, of course, this theme of so much fear of disease. And it gave me the sense of like, okay, they were okay. They found meaning in their lives. They lived through this, and we can too. And so in that way, the two professions, I suppose, really intertwined and helped me at sort of the perfect moment when I needed it.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Thank you.
And Kai, tell us how you got into this terrible, terrible writing game.
Right. So I was a big reader, big bookworm when I was a kid. I was also writing a bunch of stories and passing notes, but for me it was poetry. So when I was a kid, I loved to write poems. I wished I could write stories, and there were some students in my class who I would remember they would write these stories, and they'd be like creating worlds and like characters and all of this stuff, and I couldn't figure out how to do it. I was like, I don't even know where they got that stuff from. So I just stuck to poetry, and my poems were like pretty basic, but I liked that about them. I liked that they were like, I felt they were controllable, and I was able to communicate through poetry. And when I was probably in about the 4th grade, we had a wax museum, and my teacher suggested that I be Maya Angelou, who at the time I didn't know about, but I ended up learning Phenomenal Woman, and I recited that at the wax museum. And I fell in love with Maya Angelou, but also with just what I felt like poetry could do at that point. And so I kept writing. I was writing a lot of poetry. I got into playwriting when I was about 12 and wanted to write church plays and, tell these kind of like family stories on stage because I was also a theater kid and loved, storytelling in that way. Then I got into screenwriting and, thought that I would do that. I worked on a film set. Someone made me cry, and then they told me that I wasn't allowed to cry, and then I quit, and I was like, well, obviously, that's not for me. And so it wasn't until I was, an adult, I guess in my 20s, that I started writing fiction. I had not ever been writing fiction, not really at that point. It was also at that time when I was first exposed to reading fiction by authors who shared identities with myself. I had been reading a lot of, I grew up and went to predominantly white schools, and I was reading a lot of, fiction by white authors. And so when I first started writing, I thought I had to write, about white people, because I was like, I don't know, this is what books are. And so I tried to do that, and it was really bad because I didn't know what I was talking about. So it wasn't until much later in my life, when I was like probably late 20s, that I finally embraced my own identity and the stories that I had to tell. And, you know, I was in school at that point, and I just kept going back to school because I didn't know what I was doing with my life. And, you know, I was mostly majoring in English or creative writing subjects because it was just what I loved. And, you know, similar to you at first, I was like, well, I got to do something practical. So I was pre-law when I was in undergrad, but I had no passion for it. All I really wanted to do was just read and write. So, yeah, I started writing fiction. I, you know, went to a master's program where I wrote a story that ended up becoming my novel. And at the time, I didn't know that that would be the case. I was just asked by my professor to write a story based on a memory of my own childhood, and to try to bring that memory to life with, you know, enough sensory details to make someone feel like they were there. And so I did that, and I wrote a story that contains 2 scenes that are still in the book now. And I have since, you know, made the book not about me, because once I decided to turn it into a novel, the first thing I decided was, this has to be a fictional character. I'm not ready to write a memoir. So, you know, so that was kind of my journey. And then I went to school again and got a PhD in creative writing. And that's where I really had the time and space and opportunity to write. And I was able to workshop with people who cared about what I was writing and wanted to help me, you know, make it better. And I, you know, met some people there who helped me along on the journey. And now I'm just doing it.
Oh. And, you know, I think if you were listening to all 3 stories, we're hearing stories found you guys where you were. They found you in the bookstore. They found you, you know, working as a nurse. They found you through poetry, and then, you know, you internalized them, and you found who you were through what you were writing in some way. So I think that's a really common identity that we can all kind of share. But I want to come back to you, Kai, because talking about your book, you know, it's a coming-of-age story, and, you know, there's been lots of those throughout, you know, history. It's not a new thing, but your book is different. Your novel is different because it's a story about Black girlhood, and we don't have a lot of those stories. So can you tell our audience, you know, why was it important for you to write that?
Yeah, so like I said, I mean, the book was born from a story about my own experience. So it's funny, a lot of people ask me, why did you decide to write these kinds of books and tell these kinds of stories? And I'm like, well, I don't know that I decided as much as these are the stories that I have to tell, you know, because I write based on the experiences that I've had and what's meaningful to me. And I'm actually teaching the Bluest Eye right now. So I'm a professor at Santa Clara University, and I'm teaching the Bluest Eye in one of my classes. It's a senior seminar. And we watched an interview that Toni Morrison did where she was talking about something really similar and just saying, like, I don't know that I'm doing anything specific or on purpose outside of just putting an experience on the page. And I think that's what's happening for me. You know, coming of age made sense because I think that there were things that I wanted to explore about that time period. And I'm really fascinated in general about the perspective of young people, and, you know, wanting to tell a story for adults from the perspective of a kid, and just kind of reminding us of what that experience was like. And I've had so many wonderful experiences hearing from people who've read the book, and they're just like, oh my gosh, this reminded me of this thing about my childhood, and, you know, made me nostalgic in these ways. And that's a cross identity, right? I've had people reach out to me and say those things, and they're, you know, quick to start with telling me how they feel like they should have nothing in common with the character in this book. And they're like, you know, telling me about themselves, and they're like, somehow I felt really connected to this character. And, you know, I think that's what I love about writing Black girlhood stories is, first of all, I can read Black girlhood stories by other authors and find myself there, I can find things so sometimes I write things and then I'll go read something else and it's like very similar. And I'm like, wow, you know, we're all in the same conversation, which is really beautiful. But also it's so universal. I think it gives people an opportunity to see into an experience in a way that they may have not before, but it also makes people who have lived that experience feel so welcome on the page. And whichever one of those things describes you, whether it's your identity or it's not, you're going to be able to connect to it.
I mean, I've never been an 11-year-old girl.
Yeah.
So, but I found a way to connect.
Yeah.
And I really loved, you captured the voice of, I think, someone that age. Was that a difficult thing for you to connect with in your writing? Did you have to go back now and then and say, this sounds like a Santa Clara University professor and not an 11-year-old girl?
Yeah, it was so hard. It was really difficult and really easy, I think, at the same exact time, because what happened was I got to know KB so well that I knew what her voice sounded like. So as soon as I'd be writing, I'd put something down, and then I would hear it, and I'd be like, well, that's not her voice. And so for years, while I was working on this novel, I felt like she was talking to me. She was always in my head. I could hear her. I know what her voice sounds like. I know what she moves like. I know what the world looks like through her eyes. So it became easier the more I did it. But when I first started, it was originally just me trying to remember being a young girl in the 90s in Detroit or Lansing, depending on where I was at the time, and just trying to put as much of that memory on the page and just, trying to get it down before I forgot it. And then as I was really trying to craft it and mold it, I was paying attention to a bunch of things. I have 3 daughters. They're sitting right there smiling at me. And I paid attention to them, like what kinds of things were going on with them. I think as I was working out, like, sibling dynamics, it was very helpful to have them around fighting all the time, because I was like, oh, good, I'm going to put that on the page. So yeah, it came easily once I was doing it, because I think I just came to know the character so well that her voice isn't my voice. She's someone I know, and I'm just writing down her experience.
Does she still talk to you?
I'm trying to not let her talk to me, because I'm trying to work on other things. So now I have other people talking to me. So I told her to go chill out for a little bit.
Well, I was going to comment later that I thought the relationship between KB and Nia was so authentic. So now I know where you got it from your own children.
Oh, well, I have an older sister too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So she was the main inspiration for the, because she got on my nerves. She's in Chicago, and she's probably watching this right now. I love you. Her initials are actually KB. I named my main character after her. So.
Well, then she forgives you.
Yes.
Amanda, you aren't as... you don't identify as much with your main characters, I think, as Tommy and Kai will. But... So your book, The Second Life of Mirielle West, is about a journey, and it's historical fiction that takes place almost entirely in the 1920s, because there's an epilogue. But I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration for writing this book? You do talk about this in the afterword of your book, but for those of you who haven't read that, how did you come across the subject of leprosy, or Hansen's disease is what it's more known as now, and why did you choose this as a topic?
My previous book was about undertaking and a little bit of the history of undertaking, and I really found that I had enjoyed the medical history piece of that. And so as I was thinking about what I wanted to write next, I was thinking maybe something with another medical history theme. So I was at the library, the college library where I live, just sort of perusing the shelves, and I see this, it's a tiny little book called Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. And I pulled it out because I was kind of flabbergasted just by the title. I thought, leprosy in America, what? I'm an infection prevention nurse, and I didn't even realize that this had ever been a disease that was endemic in the United States. So I pull it off the shelf, I read it cover to cover there at the library, and I was so struck by a couple of things. First, I was struck by how little I knew about the disease, and how what I did know or thought I knew about the disease was wrong. And I was also struck, you have this sense, again, I think because of the way that the disease is often portrayed in popular literature, that someone who was at a leper colony or a hospital that was treating the disease, like these were people that just went to die, and they were literally just waiting for death. And that wasn't the case with Carville. Certainly, the patients who went there suffered great tragedy, not only from the disease and the isolation of being there, but the stigma that surrounds the disease. But even in spite of that, in spite of being taken from their families, in spite of facing this harrowing disease, and at the time there was no cure, they still found a way to build connections with one another and find meaning and humor and friendship in their lives. And that really struck me. And I thought, you know, if someone like me with a nursing background that does infectious disease, that I didn't know about this place, Carville, maybe there are other people out there who didn't as well. And, you know, I will say part of what I think draws me to historical fiction even is this idea that there is so much in the past that is still relevant to our lives today. And though Hansen's disease is now entirely treatable and, you know, completely an outpatient disease, there are still things and instances where we're ascribing a level of morality to bacteria, viruses, things like that don't have any innate moral goodness or badness attached to them. And so I felt like there was something in the tragedy of Carville and the way that these people were ripped apart from their lives that might still resonate with people today. And I hoped, you know, navigate our lives a little bit better, maybe with a little less of that initial fear and a little bit more compassion.
Now, I can see in the book, there's a number of characters. There's patients, there's doctors, there's the nun administrators and nurses. And there's a lot of places you could have gone in focusing on a main character and whose story you would be telling in this book. You chose to pick who at the start is a pretty despicable woman.
Yes.
You know, Mirielle was not Mother of the Year.
No.
At the start of the novel. And why did you choose her, someone like her, you know, from Hollywood, not from the South, but, you know, someone who'd be going through a massive cultural adjustment as well as this medical situation? Why did you pick her as a character?
I wanted someone, and part of it was purely logistical. I wanted there to be great space in between her family and her. And I was, you know, when I am writing, I'm trying to stick to the historical record as best I can. So there were a handful of states in the 1920s where Hansen's disease was endemic, and California was one of them. So I thought, well, that's someplace that's far away. There certainly could have been, certainly plausible that she could have lived there. And then from there, you know, I just started thinking about, you know, my own perceptions of California. And, you know, I thought, you know, it would be really interesting to pull in some of the silent film things that were happening at the time. And there's such a piece of the disease is this idea of the disfigurement. Even though that doesn't happen with every patient who gets the disease, I think that's what's really in the forefront of, certainly of my mind when I think about leprosy, Hansen's disease. And so having a character for whom image and status was so important, bringing her someplace, again, that's very far away from where she is, where she has to deal with sort of this breakdown of that part of her identity. I wanted her to sort of be brought very low so that then you can, she can be rebuilt through the story. And that's sort of why I made the choice of her particular background.
Well, it was, I was very happy in some parts where she was brought low.
It's true, and it's difficult.
She's hanging from the barbed wire fence and breaks her arm. I was like, good.
You deserve that. You deserve that.
It's mean of me, but I was in a bad mood that day. Let's move on to a few audience questions. Of course, you know, we're still recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think it affected all of us in different ways. I know all of you had been working on your books before the pandemic started, but certainly, like reading your book, Amanda, you can't help but think about what we went through during that. How did any aspect of the pandemic affect you as a writer and perhaps the subjects that you're thinking about writing about? Yeah. Kai, do you want to kick us off with that one?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, so I think the biggest thing that happened is during the pandemic, I couldn't write. And I thought there was going to be this beautiful moment of like, okay, everything's slowed down. Like normally I have a very busy life. I have, I had a full-time job. I think at that time, I was a PhD student and I had a full-time job. And I have a husband, and I have 3 kids, and I did not have a puppy. He's a pandemic puppy. But I had a lot going on. And so when everything slowed down, there was actually a moment where my husband and I were like, whew, thank goodness, because like somebody had to stop us, right? Because our kids were like in all the extracurriculars, and every day was just like full to the max. So I'm thinking, okay, like everything is quieted down. I'm about to write. Like I'm about to write like an American classic during this time, And not only did I not write an American classic, I couldn't write anything. I just found that all the things I usually did in terms of my writing habits were just not working. And I think it was because everything was just so upside down. So the thing that happened for me during the pandemic is that I had to reconstruct my entire creative practice and figure out like what actually was at the core of it and how it worked even when I felt upside down. And so the things that I learned then about myself as a writer and about my creative process and what works well for me and what kinds of things I need and what feeds my creativity, those are things now that still are the base of my writing practice. So in that way, I'm really thankful for it. For me, it was interesting because during that time when things were so dark, that's actually when a lot of really wonderful things happened in my writing career. That's when I sold my first novel. I finished writing my second novel during that time, which is not, y'all can't read it yet. It's not out. But I was writing it for my dissertation in my PhD program, so I finished that up during that time. It was just like so many really great things were happening in my writing career as everything around me was just really so frightening. So I think there was a lot of navigating that, but I think ultimately it ended up just forcing me to get to know myself as a writer in ways that I hadn't before.
Did either of you find that to be the experience you had?
Well, I would say like you, I had a really hard time writing during the pandemic. Certainly at the very, very beginning, I was finishing The Second Life of Mirielle West, and that was, I think, like I mentioned, sort of helpful, but then trying to write the next book, and I felt like everyone else was writing so well. It just like that was the what you were seeing out there. Oh, I just finished this novel or this, and I thought, what am I doing wrong? Yeah. But it did sort of bring me back to, okay, what is my process? And I will say too, the book that I wrote during the pandemic, it's much lighter than my other books because for me, like what I was reading, I love to read all kinds of things, but during the pandemic, I just wanted to read things that were light, that would transport me to some place that was silly and whimsical and wonderful. And so I brought a little bit more of that into the novel that I wrote during that time.
We've got another good question here about advice that you might give. You've all talked about how you started. There was struggling, there was different ways of finding your voice. What advice would you give to a young writer? And I think you give a lot of this, so but what would you give to a young writer who's just starting out or another author who's struggling? Amanda, you wrote an entire novel that didn't get published. So you must have some lessons from that.
Yeah, so I think it sort of dovetails nicely actually with what Tommy was saying, because I think the discipline is so important. And right alongside that, I think it's the perseverance that you write a full novel and realize that this is not very good. And you say, like, okay, I'm going to get better and I'm going to learn and I'm going to write another novel. And that you keep going, because there is a lot of, I would say, like, downturns along the way, a lot of pitfalls, a lot of, missteps, a lot of people that are going to even not necessarily maliciously, but like tell you, this is not good enough. And part of that is the believing, I suppose, in yourself that I can get there, I can get to that place where it is good enough, and continuing to come back to the page day after day after day until you get there.
Yeah, my advice is extremely similar to the things you all are saying. I'm always telling my students, to write as much as they can, to practice. I love what you said. I had a professor who had me do that same thing, just practice writing out things. And whenever I feel stuck with writing, I'll go back to things I loved reading. And I'll just, again, pay attention to the words and what made me love this? What feels, good about this? So writing a lot and reading a lot. And, I always say this thing about, figure out what works best for you and then do that. Because I think I spent a lot of time trying to mimic what other people were telling me I should do if I was a writer. They were telling me their habits, and then I would try to take those on. But they didn't work for me. They weren't my habits. So I spent a lot of time figuring out what makes me feel creative and what schedule works for me and what types of things, what can I surround myself with that'll help me feel more creative. So that was a big part of it. And I would say the last thing I'd add to that is just trying as much as you can to stay true to whatever sparked this passion in you in the first place, because I think as you're going through it, it's very easy to get super far away from that and be caught up in all of these other things. And I met a writer recently who said something to one of my students about, I think the student was asking about revision and was trying to understand how can I figure out how to describe something? They were struggling with something they were writing in a poem, and they were, wondering how to fix it in revision. And he advised them to actually get away from the page and to go back to the thing that inspired them to write that line in the first place. Because I think so often we get just really caught up on the words that we've written, and it's why did I write these words, though? What inspired me? What was behind that? And going back to that will often give you the answer that you need, but also it'll just keep you human, because I think so much of this industry is just, it's very easy to get lost. It's very easy to get lost in different things and get concerned about things and get worried about things. And I think for me, it's very grounding to just return to writing and to be able to be in a space right now where I still love writing so deeply. And when people ask me, what are your hobbies? I'm like, writing. And they're like, that's your job. And I'm like, but it's still my biggest hobby, That might sound silly, but it's the thing that just makes me feel the best. It makes me feel like me. It's just something that I don't want to lose that feeling no matter what. So those would be the main things I'd advise.
Do any of you have a rigid writing, I write 500 words a day, or I write in this specific spot whenever I write, or is it pretty fluid? But
I was just going to say, my new thing this year is just trying to get in. It was 25 minutes. I've recently upped it to 30 minutes this week. Just trying to get in little pieces of writing each day. If I can get in 25 to 30 minutes of just focusing on the project I'm working on, because my life is just really busy right now. So when I tried to have schedules beyond that, I found that I was feeling disappointed all the time because I wasn't hitting those goals, and then that would set me back, and then I wouldn't do anything, and then I'd feel crippled for a while, and it was just nonstop. So now I'm just okay, I just want to stay connected to what I'm doing. So if I'm sitting here and I have, I'm in office hours and my students are not showing up, I'm going to take this 25 minutes and I'm just gonna, I'm gonna do something with them. But I try to write every day. It's not the same time, it's not the same amount. Sometimes write means look online for 25 minutes or, think about titles or make playlists or, I do all of these things that are related. And to me that counts because, they're helping my project along in one way or the other.
The question for you is the white neighbor family living across the street in the book, so this is very specific, based on a combination of real people from your life Their strong reactions to the two young girls and the grandpa is beautifully portrayed and almost hard to read. Thank you.
No, they're not based on any particular family. So I think one of the things I was playing around with in the novel was who was KB interacting with, right? So it's a story about a young girl, and at times she's kind of lonely. She doesn't have, really anyone to talk to. She has an older sister who's kind of outgrowing her, so they're not playing much or talking much. Her grandfather's, kind of grumpy and keeps to himself. Her mother's away. So honestly, one thing that happened as I was writing was I realized, like, I got to give this kid somebody to talk to, because she was just talking to herself all the time and writing in her diary and sitting outside being bored. And I was like, yeah, she's bored and the reader's going to be bored too. So I wanted to give her, people. And the idea for the children that she meets across the street, it just kind of came from wanting to explore what would happen if she met, some kids who were different than her. She, talks about how she hasn't had, white friends before, so she's pretty excited, and, but everything just, she's noticing all of the kind of differences. And I went back and forth a lot about what I wanted to do with those characters, and I'm not going to say what I ultimately decided to do because we're not doing spoilers, but I wanted to use those characters to kind of show some different things, like some different generational things, to show the ways that kids might want to exist if it wasn't for the interference of, old school mentalities around things, but also the way that, some things are, kind of coming into our minds, and even at a young age, we're just products of all of that, and, can come to behave a certain way even before we understand what anything means, before we understand the differences between ourselves and someone else. We might start to other them or start to pick on them or start to, and we maybe don't even get it. We don't even know why we're doing it, but maybe, messages are being passed down and things like that. So that was kind of what I wanted to explore with those relationships. And the young girl that KB befriends ends up being, she's like pretty much her biggest confidant, the person who she, finally opens up to after, navigating some pretty intense trauma. This is someone who she feels like she can trust and open up to. And I also wanted to explore what would happen if that type of vulnerability was challenged.
Okay, thank you. Amanda, with writing about Carville, which was something you weren't aware of when you started, have you, since the book was published, heard from anyone who had been connected to the Carville community? And can you share their reaction if you did?
I've heard from a couple of people. One I heard from he was the Assistant Surgeon General, retired now, but he had been the physician that was there when they closed Carville, after, again, they discovered a cure and began treating it outpatient. And he closed Carville, and he wrote and said that he really liked the book. And I was, thrilled that he said that it felt very true to what was happening there and to the disease. And as I mentioned, I'm always trying to get the details as correct as possible, so that was really rewarding. And then I've heard from two other people, both of whom had relatives at Carville. And what was really neat is, again, because of the stigma, and so many people would have a relative that would go to Carville, and then no one would talk about it, or they would make up another story that person had died, or that person had a mental illness and were sent away, all kinds of things to mask what had really happened. And so in both of these situations, they were people who they didn't know until they were well into adulthood that their relative had been there. And so they were sort of exploring it for the first time, and were able to connect a little bit to what it would have been like during that time in my book. And so that was wonderful, wonderful to hear.
It's great validation after you put all that effort to say, okay, it resonated with them.
Yeah.
Okay, bonus question for Kai. This is from a junior in high school. I've always had a penchant for poetry, but struggle with storytelling. How did you work on overcoming your weakness? I didn't call you weak.
No, I did feel that way. I felt that telling stories in that way was really difficult to me. I think one of the biggest things was I had to realize that I already knew how to tell stories. I think I was like, sometimes it feels to you like there's this secret society, right? And you're like, these people are like trained to know how to tell stories or like write books, or, it's like this official thing. And it took me a while, even after I wrote a novel and was on the road to publication, it took me a while to feel like my book was like a real book, like I had told a real story and it was a thing. So I think a lot of it is actually self-doubt. It's, I think that you are able to tell stories, but you just have to give yourself a chance to do it. But also, I think the more that you learn about storytelling, the more confident you'll feel when you do it. So I just spent a lot of time just trying to learn everything that I could about storytelling. And I did that by reading a lot and paying attention to what I loved about stories. I found authors to love, and once I loved them, I just got obsessive. Like, I wanted to read everything they had written. I wanted to hear every interview they had done. I wanted to listen to the time that they came on this radio show or read this one small thing that they wrote this one time back in the day. And by becoming immersed in their journey in that way, I started to realize, like, oh, this is a person who talked in this interview about struggling or not feeling like they knew how to do this same thing that now I'm looking at them and thinking, this is the ultimate, vision of storytelling. So I think doing those kinds of things really helped me. And then also just realizing the connections between poetry and prose. I think all of it is very closely tied together. So, if you're already a poet, I'd suggest, thinking about your poetry as storytelling. What stories are you telling when you're writing poetry? And, maybe practice writing a prose poem, like if the poetic form makes you feel comfortable, then tell stories in that way. And then, as you're doing that, play around with getting some more prose in there. Play around with characters in your poetry. Play around with setting in your poetry. It's all storytelling. So, my advice would be to just kind of keep doing that, building on that, and gaining your confidence in your voice.
Great advice. Okay, we are closing up, so I want to ask each of you very quickly, what have you got coming next? Amanda?
I'm working on a novel right now about a woman doctor in 1900, so still kind of with this medical history theme, who is about on the brink of ruin, and so she joins a snake oil salesman and his traveling medicine show, and it's her sort of way to sort of reclaim her sense of what her love of really practicing medicine and finding that all sort of set against the backdrop of the Galveston hurricane that happened that year in 1900.
Great. And Kai?
I'm working on 2 novels right now, and I don't know what's going to happen with either of them exactly, but one I've been working on for almost 6 years, I think. And it's a young adult novel, actually, so it'd be a bit different than what I'm doing, but still a coming-of-age story about a young black girl who's a high schooler and is navigating identity, and it's set kind of at the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, so some of that context. And then the next novel that I'm working on is a travel novel that was inspired by my own story of having never traveled outside of the country. And so I'm writing this book about a character who's never traveled internationally, and she gets this travel writing job by, basically lying and making up all of these fake travels. And then she gets the job, so now she has to go and figure out how to see the world. And the really cool thing is I'm traveling with her. So I just went out of the country for the very first time last month, and I went to Italy, and I went to Rome and Florence, and you know, my character got kind of some of this inspiration. She was watching Eat, Pray, Love randomly with her friends. They were kind of like watching it and ripping it apart. And then she's like, well, you know what? Maybe I'm going to go and do that, you know, and go to Rome and see what happens. So I don't know what will happen with that novel because I'm going to let it unfold as I travel.
Okay, well, we'll wait for that. Yeah. I'm looking forward to reading all of these when they come out. And I want to thank you so much for sharing your time with us. I'm really glad that your journeys brought you here to Silicon Valley Reads. And I want to thank the audience for being a great audience and having good questions. Please, if you haven't read their books, read their books, enjoy the rest of our programming, and certainly share our companion books with the younger readers in your lives. Thank you again, and that's it for our program. I'll hand it over to Jill.
Thank you. Thank you, Sal and Kai, Amanda, and Tommy for that great program. I'm Jill Bourne, City Librarian for the San Jose Public Library. Sal, you have been moderating for Silicon Valley Reads for 7 kickoff events. We want to thank you for giving so much of your time over the years and being an exceptional moderator. We have a certificate of appreciation for you. And please join us all in giving Sal another round of applause. Thank you.
Taking a year off, but I'll be back.
And could we actually have another round of applause for our amazing guest authors tonight?
Okay. No, we're done.
So our authors are going to be available to sign books until 9 p.m. this evening. Tommy's table will be in the Euphrat Museum, and Kai and Amanda will both be signing books out in the lobby. We also have books for sale in the lobby through Books Inc. Campbell if you would like to purchase any books tonight. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please consider supporting Silicon Valley Reads. There is a QR code on the back of your program that takes you to a donation page where you can use PayPal or a credit card. We also have a donation table in the lobby where we can accept cash or checks. If you think your organization would like to donate to Silicon Valley Reads, please let us know. Our contact information is on our website. So thank you all so much for being here tonight and for tuning in online. The video of this event will be posted for the next 2 weeks. And please join us for over 150 free events for all ages upcoming through March. Amanda will be visiting 2 libraries tomorrow, and Kai will be doing a handful of presentations over the next 2 months. Visit siliconvalleyreads.org to view the presentations and the complete list and register for events. We look forward to seeing you at other Silicon Valley Reads events as we embark on a journey to new beginnings. Thank you and good night.